And for more on this 10th anniversary of the November 2015 Paris attacks, I'm joined in studio by Matthew Dalton, reporter with the Wall Street Journal. Matthew was covering the attacks at the time and also covered the aftermath as the hunt for those responsible progressed. Good morning, Matthew, and thank you for joining us. You were there on November 13th, 10 years ago. Can you tell us how the terrible evening unfolded for you?
Well, I'd been working that Friday, and I'd left the office, and I was sitting at a cafe. I think I'd ordered a beer, and I was looking at my email. I think at that point, I guess we had iPhones at that point, and I suddenly got an email from our bureau chief that we started exchanging emails that there were reports of some kind of attack happening in the eastern part of Paris. Then we also started getting reports of maybe an attack happening at the Stade de France, at multiple cafes. It was completely, we were just kind of trying to figure out what was happening on the ground. And so I paid and ran back to the office and started making phone calls and watching French news channels to like France 24 to try and get a sense of what was going on. We had a few people who happened to be in the neighborhood at the time because it was Friday night, and so they tried to do some on the ground reporting. So it was just kind of France had gone through this on a much smaller scale with the Charlie Hebdo attacks about 10 months prior, but what was happening, we kind of started to appreciate that what was happening that night was on a totally different scale.
Now, looking back, this was Paris's second major terrorist attack in the space of a year, and there was a third one to follow the following summer in Nice. French intelligence services at the time were strongly criticised for failing to anticipate it. In your view, what were the main failures there?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call it just a French failure. I think it was a European failure because, the attackers, many of them came from Belgium. So they came particularly from a neighborhood from Molenbeek, which is a neighborhood in Brussels, and the Belgians had been tracking their movements. They had gone to Syria. And what we found out afterwards is that many of them came back disguised as refugees, Syrian refugees, and they at the time, Europe didn't have Europe-wide databases for identifying potential criminals and suspected terrorists who were coming back in to Europe. This threat of there's the Syrian civil war was the big threat, and excuse me. And the Syrian civil war was the big threat, and the concern was that these radicalized people were going to be coming back in and striking Europe because of Europe's support for the fight against terrorism. It was sort of a theoretical concern, and frankly, Europe didn't have the databases and the intelligence to track people coming in. A lot of these people used forged Syrian passports. That was a threat that was kind of theoretical. But I would say that certainly some of the blame lies in the French intelligence services, but Europe as a whole was not prepared to meet this threat.
Thank you. We'll bring in once again our international affairs editor, Philip Turle. Philip, these three attacks that happened between January 2015 and July 2016, to what extent can those attacks be linked to a rise in popularity of the far right in France, particularly the National Rally?
Well, it's actually quite complicated to align the fact that the National Rally is gaining support as a result of terrorist attacks in France, because as we've just been saying, there hasn't been a huge terrorist attack for 10 years, a lot on being in Nice 9 years ago on the Promenade des Anglais. So the threat from Islamic State and from Al-Qaeda in France is not as great as it was 10 years ago. Islamic State has been vastly reduced in its capacity to launch attacks from overseas into France, similar to the ones that we saw at the Bataclan and in Paris 10 years ago today. So that has certainly changed radically, where the problem lies now is the radicalization of young people via the internet, via TikTok, via Telegram, via social media. And that is something that authorities are looking into. And I think it's a very, very big challenge for France to try to take that on board and make sure not more people are not being radicalized in their bedrooms without even being egged on by jihadist groups from overseas or elsewhere. So how much has that led to support of the far-right national rally? Well, if you look around Europe, there's been growing support for far-right movements in many countries. We've seen it growing with AfD in Germany. We've seen the same in Italy with Giorgia Meloni taking power. There's the rise of Nigel Farage and the far right in the United Kingdom. So there is a general increase in support for far right movements. But here in France, if there were an election tomorrow, it's certainly true that the far right national rally would come first with Jordan Bardella, way above, way further ahead than any of the other traditional parties. And if you couple with what he is expected to gain if there were an election today at 35.5%, you put with that Eric Zemmour from the Reconquête far-right party, who's even more far-right than Jordan Bardella and the National Rally, you'd have pretty much close to 40% of French people who would vote in favour of a far-right party. So that is something that needs to be taken into account. The problem is also that there are no other strong leaders in the other parties that have come forward as someone who could act as a deterrent or a counterbalancing act for the National Rally. No one who has the support that could actually beat the National Rally if there were a presidential election tomorrow. So there may be a link between terrorism, but it's a much wider, I think, concern about loss of values in France, the loss of traditions, the fear of insecurity, the fear of Europe, all sorts of elements put together that have been jumped on by more populist movements. And that's what people are now feeling that they can vote for, because that will make them in turn feel more secure. But certainly there is a link between the terrorist threat and support for the far right, which is seen as the party which can probably best deal with that threat in the future.
Matthew, France is still on an elevated terrorist threat today, even though most attacks in recent years have been relatively small scale. Where does the country stand with regard to security against terrorism?
I think they've done a lot of good work, and they're much better prepared for some kind of attack like this in the future. As you pointed out, most of the recent attacks have been small scale. They've been they haven't involved firearms, which has been a big thing. They've mainly involved knives, stabbing attacks. So one of the big things that happened in November 13th is these terrorists were able to get automatic firearms, and that's a problem. Obviously, the United States has been confronting for a long time, but gun laws in Europe are much stricter, and yet they were able to access black markets that were able to move the guns around Europe, and that was a big problem in Belgium, because the black markets for firearms in Belgium were actually at the time quite lively. I think that has been shut down quite a bit. There's also, I think, just the recognition of the threat of radicalization in French society. A lot of most of the attackers were from Belgium or France. They grew up in Belgium or France, and they had been radicalized in the kind of with the news of the Syrian civil war. Before these terrorist attacks started happening, a lot of people were going to Syria to fight, and it was regarded, because they were fighting Bashar Assad, it was regarded as the authorities, because the Western governments were opposed to Assad also, they didn't quite appreciate the threat that these people could pose after having fought in a war zone and coming back. Now, Islamist ideologies are really, I think in French schools in particular, throughout French society, this program of fighting radicalization has really been taken much more seriously than it was in the past. So I think there's been a lot of work on the security services to detect these threats better, and there's been a lot of good work to try and prevent radicalization.
And Philip, can I just ask you, how do you think France has changed, politics aside, since 2015?
I think people are much more aware of the threat of terrorism. I think that back in 2015, as Matthew's been saying, France and Europe were not ready for this kind of attack. I don't think they thought it was possible that this would happen. And that's why the necessary steps were not taken at the time to prevent this from happening. Were they able to take those steps? It's very difficult to know. I think today that there is much more awareness about the threat of radicalization, about the possibility that attacks could be launched in France. We've had several attacks since then, but they've left long scars or big scars on France, particularly the decapitation of a teacher, Samuel Paty, since 2015, which has also affected France and made people understand that even if the authorities are doing the best they can, then the threat is still there, and that is something we all need to be aware of.
Thank you very much for that, Philip Turle, and also thank you to Matthew Dalton, reporter with the Wall Street Journal.